Hello and welcome to this explanation of postmodernism. Postmodernist views of society. We're going to discuss two things, identity and inequality. So postmodernists focus on choice and change in contemporary society. So looking at contemporary society, which means the past 40 years or so, since the 1980s onwards, there's arguably been a shift in the characteristics of society. According to most postmodernists, we've entered a new era, or a different form of society to those in the past. So postmodernist societies are a response to the modernist perspectives of functionalism, Marxism, Weberianism and feminism. So whereas those earlier theories, or what Lyotard calls grand narratives, developed views of society based around key central ideas like function and purpose in the case of functionalism, capitalism and exploitation, economic divisions in the case of Marxism, feminism, patriarchy, cultural dimensions, power of women and men, and Weberianism looked at a more multi-dimensional view with culture, social factors and economic factors. The postmodernists consider there not to be any one overriding explanation of society. They think that all of these earlier theories are all historically and socially relative. In other words, they're products of their time. So functionalism, Marxism and so on come from the particular historical and socio-economical context in which they're created. So postmodernists argue there's not one truth to explain society. They focus very much on cultural relativity, that all views of society are a product of their socio-historical economic context. That said, they're influenced by the earlier theories. They're still sociological in the sense that they argue about the relationship between society and the individual. Where the earlier theories focused more predominantly on structures like class structures, age structures, gender structures, ethnic structures and hierarchies, structures in terms of the institutions of society, the family, media, workplace, the institution of inequality itself as a key pattern of behaviour, the structure of the culture of society. The postmodernists are influenced by social action theories as well as the structure theories, and so they also focus on the idea of human agency or action. So they talk about how we are active and not passive in forming an identity. We actively shape our identity as individuals, as well as being influenced by the world around us. So postmodernists focus on both sides, structure, social structures, and human agency or action, and they say that these can operate or influence behaviour at different times. There's not one factor which shapes things at any one time. The postmodernists talk about choice, so they emphasise uncertainty, insecurity, and the transient nature of identity and behaviour. In other words, there's no fixed identity for anyone anymore. There's no idea of a job for life in terms of social class. The class system is becoming more fragmented or broken up into smaller fractions. Some postmodernists argue that we've gone beyond fragmentation and that class is dead. So Pakulski and Waters emphasise this, saying that economic clusterings or collective groupings around property and material resources are less important than status based on consumption. So we've moved from occupational wealth to consumer-based status and identity, which implies the idea of the marketplace of choice, what we call cultural supermarket, that you've got such a wide array of choices in terms of identity. Age, gender and ethnicity also play a role in identity, not just or more than class. In terms of insecurity and choice, this means society has changed, so it creates more uncertainty. Family life is less reliable in terms of one traditional form. There are alternative forms of family which may be equally functional and provide for people in different ways that are just as good as the nuclear family. So Judith Stacey talks about the postmodern family. The blurring of boundaries between different groups, class, age, gender, ethnic groups, the blurring of boundaries between family life and workplace, education, peer group. In other words, that these different institutions and structures no longer have such a solid and reliable influence on people's identity. This is emphasised by people like Jacques Lyotard, who talks about the media saturation of society, where the media increasingly plays a big role in our identity, which means that the family and education are competing for influence over the media. Think of how people are influenced by what they see on their mobile phone, their screens, the surfaces around them, rather than the members of institutions like teachers and parents. That again is debatable. Okay? And there's also Giddens, who developed the structuration theory, which is combining the ideas of structure and action. And he says that we're able to create structures, but we're limited by structures at the same time. So we can be creative in our actions, in changing structures, but within certain limitations. There are different views of choice and uncertainty. Giddens argues that greater choice, for example in family life and relationships and in the workplace, could lead to equality, because people are able to exercise autonomy or individual freedom about how they wish to behave and role they want to occupy. Ulrich Beck, has a more pessimistic or sceptical view about choice and uncertainty. He says that this can lead to the feeling of anxiety because people no longer can rely on a fixed position in the world. Identity is less certain. Postmodernists also talk about the merging of identities, like hybridization processes, where there's a mixing of traditions and cultures to create new novel forms. Like Madood talks about code switching, where people change their behaviour in different settings, with their peer group using different language to their family. There's the idea of merged identities, like the concept of British and Asian coming together to form Brasian, which is like a new identity formed from that. That would be supported by Joe Hallam Baines. In terms of class then, there are a range of views. There's also Jameson is a postmodernist. Frederick Jameson is a postmodernist sociologist who's influenced by Marxism. So he talks about globalization and a global labour market in capitalism where there's global exploitation. For example, transnational corporations, or TNCs, like Nestle, McDonald's, are able to exercise a great deal of power. In some cases they have more economic power than whole nation states. And so they're able to actually control the labour market more than governments. And so, for example, they have a labour market in Asia which they can draw upon, so that the labour market in the West is less able to exercise influence in trying to argue for wage increases. So it means that 0 hours contracts, low wage jobs, poor job security, non-unionised jobs, all of this type of work is increasing according to Jameson. Because of globalisation, it means not only sharing of information and interconnectivity in terms of culture, but also the idea of restricted power for the individual, because there's more freedom for big organisations to control economic relationships and to exploit using those global connections. So there's a range of views within postmodernism. They're generally sceptical about capitalism, and some of them are more optimistic than others, some of them are more sceptical than others, but generally critical of capitalism, critical of how culture is changing. There's two views of choice, obviously, as we've spoken about choice, but that creates uncertainty, or it's the same thing. Postmodernism can be seen as overplaying choice, overplaying uncertainty, and ignoring continuities with the past and how things have often remained the same. For example, Chester talks about the neo-conventional family. Westergaard and Ressler are Marxist influence theorists who talk about the hardening of class inequalities, with the group at the top gaining in real terms during the 1980s, group at the bottom not gaining in real terms. And so the polarisation process continuing, the gap between rich and poor increasing rather than dissolving. So postmodernists can be seen as overplaying change and ignoring continuities. If you have any questions, email daniel_butcher@hotmail.co.uk.